Real cowboys didn't ride with gleaming gun rigs slung low and polished for show. Their leather lived on the saddle, cracked, sweat-darkened, and shaped by dust and danger. Every strap, loop, and stitch served a purpose. Every scabbard was built to keep steel close, dry, and ready through 100 hard miles. Today, we're digging up 15 forgotten saddle rigs and rifle scabbards that carried the West. From the stagecoaches and buffalo ranges to the battlefields and border trails. No myths, no Hollywood quick draws, just the truth. The practical designs that kept rifles firing and riders alive. And if you want to see how that same mindset of survival and engineering evolved from the open plains to the battlefields of the 20th century. Check out my other channel, Brass and Blitz, where we uncover the real weapons and innovations that defined World War II. So cinch your girth, settle in the saddle, and meet the leatherwork that turned horsepower into survival on the American frontier. Number 15, Wagon Scabbard, the rifle that rode the coach. The West didn't run on horses alone. Much of it rolled on freight wagons and stagecoaches that carried rifles within easy reach. That's where the wagon scabbard earned its place. Bolted to the coach box or lashed beside the driver's seat, these heavy leather sleeves held rifles angled back for a clean draw. Guards for Wells Fargo, the overland stage, and mail outfits kept them ready for ambush. A hand drop, a pull, and steel was clear before the horses even slowed. Unlike saddle scabbards, these weren't meant to rest against hide or hair. They were thick, oil-soaked, and often nailed straight into wagon boards. Drain holes at the tip bled off rainwater after river crossings. Some had rawhide collars or brass throat plates to stop splinter wear. Few survived. Most rotted with the wagons they guarded. But the rare examples in the Buffalo Bill Center and Autry Museum show the scars of use. Sun-burned leather, cracked seams, and grooves worn deep by rifle barrels. The wagon scabbard wasn't built for speed or style. It was built to keep a rifle ready when a man's whole job was to reach it before the outlaws did. Number 14, Ranger Belt, weight where it belongs. Before the fancy gun belts of the silver screen cowboys, there was the working man's belt, the Ranger. Born in Texas after the Civil War, it was built to solve a simple problem: weight. A wide leather body carried the load, while two narrow billets buckled it tight, spreading pressure evenly across the hips. Mounted lawmen and cattle hands learned fast that narrow belts cut and twisted on long rides. The Ranger design stopped that. It rode high, hugged the waist, and let the holster move with the rider instead of against him. Originals were cut from oak-tanned cowhide or harness leather, sometimes lined with rawhide for stiffness. The billet loops were stitched and riveted, a detail that still shows on early examples kept at the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and the National Cowboy Museum. By the 1870s, saddlers across the Southwest were copying the pattern. Catalogs from firms like Collins and Morrison advertised double billet belts for field use. It wasn't made to impress anyone. It was made to last, the backbone of every rig that came after it. Modern gun belts, police duty belts, even military web gear still borrow its logic. Put the weight where it belongs, and the rest will follow. Number 13, California Slim Jim, high ride, no show. Long before the cartridge revolver ruled the range, there was the Slim Jim, a holster born for percussion pistols and early conversions. It was narrow, straight, and built for control, not speed. The pouch fit tight around the gun's contours, riding high on the belt so the muzzle cleared the rider's leg. Crafted from a single sheet of skirting leather, it had no skirt, no drop loop, and no flare. A simple seam ran up the front, sometimes welted for strength, and a single belt slot held it close to the body. When oiled and worn, the leather molded perfectly to the revolver it carried. Gold Rush cowboys, teamsters, and gamblers across California favored it through the 1850s and 1860s. Before the big-bore cartridge Colts pushed holster makers toward heavier rigs, Period photos show Slim Jims paired with early 1860 armies and navies, and surviving examples in the Autry Museum and the Jean Autry collection display the same slim lines and hand-tooled borders that defined Western leatherwork before the drop loop era. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't built for showdowns. It was built for the man who needed his sidearm steady, close, and ready. A quiet design for a rougher kind of West. Number 12. Half-breed rig, where two worlds met. Where Texas met Mexico, two schools of gun leather collided, and the half-breed rig was born. It blended the flowing, looped artistry of the Mexican holster with the straight, rugged lines of American saddlework. By the 1870s, cowhands and scouts along the Rio Grande were wearing them. Full skirts for stiffness, wide loops for strength, and a forward tilt that made the draw smoother from horseback. It looked refined, but it was built for work. Contemporary saddlers called them half-loops, or hybrids. And period trade catalogs from Miania and Collins and Morrison advertised them as secure for mounted service. Surviving frontier photographs show the same wide-loop silhouettes riding the hips of Texas Rangers and border lawmen. It wasn't an experiment, it was the turning point, the moment when two worlds of leatherwork met and shaped the holster that carried the West into its final decades. Number 11. Full-length cavalry scabbard. Dust has an enemy. The U.S. cavalry rode with rifles wrapped in leather, long, heavy sleeves designed to keep out the enemy that ruined more guns than war ever could, dust. Issued through the 1860s and 1870s for carbines like the Springfield Trapdoor and the Spencer, the full-length scabbard hung from the saddle's offside, mouth forward, muzzle down. A trooper could draw it with one hand at a trot without turning in the saddle. Most were cut from thick harness leather, soaked in oil or tallow, and stitched by machine along the seam. Some added brass throats or rawhide reinforcements at the opening to stop the muzzle from wearing through. Regulation patterns from the Ordnance Department even required small drain holes near the toe, a detail meant to bleed water after river crossings or sudden rain. These weren't frontier improvisations. They were military issue, measured, standardized, and built for thousands of miles of campaign riding. Originals survive in collections from Fort Concho to Fort Laramie, still stained red with the clay of the plains. A clean carbine meant a living trooper. That's why the cavalry's first defense against dust wasn't a weapon. It was the leather that carried it. Number 10. Mexican loop rig, the pattern everyone copied. If the West had a blueprint for every holster that followed, this was it. The Mexican loop rig wasn't born in Hollywood. It came from the border saddleries of the 1870s, where craftsmen folded a single skirt around a holster pouch and cut wide slots to thread it back through itself. That looping locked the pouch tight to the belt, added strength without metal, and gave the holster a second layer of protection against rain and grit. The design spread north with cowhands, lawmen, and scouts, men who valued gear that stayed where it was put. Originals were cut from heavy skirting leather, hand-dyed, and often stamped with floral borders or maker's marks from shops in El Paso, Prescott, and Tucson. The drop-loop silhouette that everyone recognizes today came straight from this design, not for speed, but for endurance. Catalogs from the 1880s listed it as secure and flexible for mounted service. And by the turn of the century, nearly every Western rig copied its form. The Mexican loop didn't just define a style, it set the standard. If you've made it this far, you're clearly here for the real history, not the movie version. Drop a like so I know to keep uncovering the gear that actually built the West. Number 9. Short carbine scabbard, speed over sleeve. When breech-loading rifles replaced the old muzzle loaders, everything changed, including the leather that carried them. Carbines like the Spencer, Sharps, and later the Springfield were shorter, faster, and meant to move with the rider. The scabbards that held them followed suit. Saddlers began cutting the sleeves down to half length, leaving the rifle's wrist and lever exposed for a faster draw. A carbine could clear leather in one pull, ready to fire without a full dismount. Mounted scouts, express riders, and cavalry detachments favored the style. It traded full protection for speed and access. These scabbards were made from oiled cowhide or rawhide lined leather, laced to the saddle's right side with the muzzle angled down. Photographs from frontier posts in the 1870s show them hanging just forward of the rider's knee, the carbine's lever glinting in the sun. They weren't meant to keep the gun clean, they were meant to keep it close. And when a second counted more than a shine, the short scabbard earned its place on the trail. Number 8. Cross-draw saddle rig, the lawman's reach. Most gunfighters drew from the right hip, but the men who rode long hours in the saddle knew better. The cross-draw rig angled the holster forward on the left side, letting a right-handed rider pull his revolver without twisting in the seat or sweeping his own horse. It was practical, fast, and safer than the straight-down draw everyone imagines. Lawmen, scouts, and express riders wore them because a clean draw on horseback meant more than style ever did. Some holsters rode almost horizontal across the belt. Others hung higher with a slight forward tilt for comfort and control. Saddlers along the frontier sold them as cross-belt holsters or left-side rigs. And catalogs from the 1880s described them as preferred for mounted service. Period photographs show sheriffs and marshals seated for portraits, their colts angled forward, proof of how common the setup really was. It wasn't about looking different, it was about surviving the ride. And for men who spent more time in the saddle than on the street, the cross-draw wasn't a trick. It was common sense in leather. Number 7. Underleg scabbard, fast and foolish. Not every idea that came off the trail was a good one. The underleg scabbard promised speed and delivered danger. Mounted scouts and a few cavalry riders fitted short rifle sleeves beneath the saddle skirt, strapping them just under the rider's right thigh. The draw was lightning fast. Drop the hand, pull straight up, and the carbine cleared leather in an instant. But the risk was obvious. One bad jump or tangled rein and the trigger could catch, sending a shot through horse or rider before either knew what happened. These rigs saw brief use in rough country where ambush was likely and seconds mattered more than safety. Reports from frontier scouts mention rifle boots fixed beneath the leg for quick use. And some surviving examples show flattened throats and sweat-darkened straps from years of close contact. Few were copied. Most riders learned the hard way that the fastest draw wasn't worth the blood it cost. The underleg scabbard earned its name, quick to reach and quicker to regret. Number 6. Rear cantle scabbard, out of the way, right away. Every ounce mattered in the saddle, especially when the miles stretched long and the trail turned mean. The rear cantle scabbard solved a problem most riders never thought about until it bruised them: balance. Instead of hanging the rifle off the side where it slapped a knee or caught brush, this rig mounted the sleeve behind the saddle seat, angled to the offside. It kept the weight centered, the rifle safe, and the rider clear. Pony Express riders, couriers, and some cavalry scouts used the setup through the 1860s and 70s. It made mounting easier and prevented the muzzle from spearing a horse when turning sharp or ducking branches. A hand could still reach back and draw without dismounting, slower than a side scabbard, but far safer on a hard run. Period photos from mail carriers and dispatch riders show the rifle's butt peeking just above the saddle roll, tied down tight with a strip of rawhide to stop it from bouncing free. No glamour, no flash, just smart weight and smooth motion. The rear cantle scabbard didn't make a man faster, it made him last longer. And out on the trail, that was worth more than speed ever was. Number 5. Double loop rig, trail-proofed leather. By the 1880s, the Mexican loop had already proven itself, but frontier riders always wanted tougher gear. That drive led saddlers to the double loop rig, a design that took everything learned on the trail and reinforced it twice over. Two wide straps anchored the holster pouch to the skirt, spreading tension across the leather so it wouldn't twist or sag after weeks of heat and rain. The result was a holster that held its shape even when the belt stretched or shrank with the weather. Cattle hands, stage guards, and scouts favored the pattern for long drives. It carried heavy revolvers like the Colt single-action army without droop or drag, and its dual loops let the rig ride closer to the hip for smoother movement in the saddle. Trade catalogs from firms like Collins and Morrison and E.L. Gallatin listed them as improved loop holsters, durable for mounted service. Period examples show twin arcs burned into the leather by sweat and years of use. The loops darkened where hands had pulled and adjusted them 100 times. The double loop wasn't an ornament. It was the working man's answer to miles, weather, and wear. The rig that finally made leather as stubborn as the men who wore it. Number 4. Buffalo Hunter Rig, Sharp's Companion. When the great buffalo hunts swept the plains in the 1870s, hunters carried rifles that were as big as the job itself, and the rigs had to match. The Buffalo Hunter rig was built for brute strength. Thick, double-stitched skirts, wide loops, and reinforced seams made it one of the heaviest holster styles on the frontier. Some even carried two, a revolver on the hip and a backup tucked cross-draw for close work around wounded game. The belts were cut extra wide to balance the weight of cartridges like the massive 50-90 Sharps or 45-120. Many included knife sheaths and pouch loops for cleaning tools, turning one piece of leather into a hunter's entire field kit. Period accounts from the Kansas and Dakota hunting camps mention broad looped belts with spare tools and cartridges. And the surviving rigs in private collections show burnished edges, brass hardware, and scars from years of rough plains weather. They weren't pretty, but they carried the rifles that built an industry and nearly ended a species. The Buffalo Hunter rig wasn't made for showdowns or parades. It was made for endurance, recoil, and the endless sound of the Sharp's rifle rolling across the prairie. Number 3, Parade Showman Rig, the Legends Leather. Not every holster on the frontier was made for war or work. Some were made to be seen. The parade rig, or showman's holster, was the West dressed for an audience. By the late 1880s, lawmen, Wild West performers, and exhibition shooters began ordering rigs heavy with silver studs, conchos, and hand engraving. Buffalo Bill Cody, Pawnee Bill, and Annie Oakley all wore versions that gleamed under stage lights. Built on the same patterns as working rigs, usually the Mexican loop or double loop. These pieces swapped plain harness leather for tooled cowhide and nickel trim. Some even bore presentation plaques or initials cut from German silver. Saddlers in Denver, San Antonio, and Kansas City competed to outshine one another, advertising parade holsters and presentation belts in their catalogs. They were symbols of rank and reputation, worn by marshals in photographs or showmen in front of cheering crowds. But for all their decoration, they still followed the same logic. A gun had to draw clean, ride steady, and sit where it belonged. The showman's rig proved one truth about the West. Even the flashiest leather still had to work. Number 2, Scout's Combo Rig, one rig, two guns. On the frontier, a man never carried more than he needed, unless it gave him an edge. That's where the Scout's Combo Rig came in. One piece of leather that carried both a rifle and a revolver, built for the riders who couldn't afford to waste motion. Army scouts, bounty hunters, and civilian guides used them through the 1870s and 1880s, rigs that slung a carbine sleeve alongside a revolver holster on the same belt or saddle skirt. It meant a man could draw his sidearm without unhooking his rifle or dismount and keep both weapons close when scouting ahead. Some were field-made, rawhide and saddle scraps riveted together, while others came from frontier shops that sold combination rigs and saddle holsters with auxiliary pouch. They weren't common, but when a man rode alone through hostile country, they made perfect sense. Originals show offset loops for balance and extra strap holes cut by hand to adjust the weight. Every one of them was unique, built for a specific gun, a specific rider, and a single purpose, to make sure that when trouble came, you didn't have to choose which weapon to reach for. The Scout's combo rig didn't belong to the movies. It belonged to the handful of men who carried the frontier on their own. Number 1. Custom Outfitter's Rig, the one-of-a-kind frontier masterpiece. Most men bought what they could afford. A few had theirs built by hand. Custom Outfitter's rigs were the crown of frontier leatherwork, one-off creations made for lawmen, scouts, and exhibition shooters who wanted their gear to fit like skin. Every detail was measured, belt width to the inch, holster angle to the draw, cartridge loops cut for a single caliber. Some were built by famous makers, Collins and Morrison, F.A., Minia, Maine, and Winchester, others by unknown saddlers working out of frontier shops from El Paso to Deadwood. They mixed designs freely, double loops for strength, half-breed skirts for balance, silver trim, or carved initials when the buyer could pay for it. Period invoices show prices ranging from $5 to $15, a month's wages for a cowboy, but a lifetime rig if treated right. A few were made for show, engraved and gifted to sheriffs or railroad agents. Most were simply the best a man could buy. Today, the few that survive tell more than fashion stories. They show fingerprints in the tooling, sweat stains dark as tar, and stretch marks where cartridges once pressed the leather thin. Each one was personal, a signature in hide and brass built for a single set of hands. The Custom Outfitter's Rig was the frontier at its finest. Practical, personal, and built to last longer than the men who rode with it. 15 rigs, each one a lesson in leather, sweat, and survival. From the wagon scabbards that guarded gold and mail to the custom masterpieces cut for men who carved their names into the frontier. Every mark, every scratch, every stitch tells the same story. A world where nothing was built for looks and everything was built to last. The West wasn't clean, it wasn't polished, but it was real. And the proof still sits behind glass and in private hands, darkened by sun, dust, and the weight of the rifles they once carried. If you've made it this far, you've seen the truth the movies never showed. Not the legends, but the craftsmanship that held them together. And if you want to see how those same lessons of design and endurance evolved into the weapons of a new century, head over to my other channel, Brass and Blitz, where we uncover the real engineering and battle stories behind World War II. This has been Top 15 Forgotten Saddle Rigs and Rifle Scabbards of the Wild West. Thanks for riding along, and until next time, keep your powder dry and your leather oiled.